Hello everyone. Today, we're going to step into a story that may feel too familiar for some of you. A story of love, rejection, and the quiet strength that comes when your heart feels bruised. Picture this with me, right now. I am standing in the middle of a brightly lit living room, the walls humming with laughter. The kind of laughter that echoes from cousins and neighbors who have gathered to celebrate. The air is thick with the smell of cake icing, and balloons squeak against each other as children run past. And in my hands, I am holding a gift, wrapped carefully in paper I chose myself, tied with a ribbon I knotted slowly, making sure it was neat, making sure it showed how much love I poured into what was inside. I had spent weeks crafting it. My fingers, stiff with age, had worked through the nights, stitching, gluing, smoothing edges, all with the thought of my granddaughter in mind. She loves bright colors, I told myself. She loves something unique, something no store shelf could ever replicate. I believed that when she opened this gift, her eyes would light up the way her mother's once did when she was small. But as the crowd gathered around her, my heart began to beat faster, not from excitement, but from something else, an old anxiety that whispered, "What if she doesn't like it? What if I'm no longer enough?" Still, I held on to hope, because hope is what a grandparent always carries. She tugged the ribbon loose, paper tearing like a drum roll in slow motion. Everyone leaned closer, waiting to see what treasure I had brought. I smiled, though my palms were damp. And then, it happened. She pulled it out, looked at it once, and then fixed her gaze directly at me. Her eyes, sharp and cold in that moment, cut deeper than any blade could. "We only want real brands," she said. The room froze. I felt it in my chest, like all the air had been sucked away. I tried to keep the smile on my face, but inside, something cracked. All those nights, all that love, dismissed in one sentence. I stood there, holding nothing but the silence that followed. Some people coughed awkwardly, others looked down at their plates, and the laughter that had filled the room just minutes earlier seemed to vanish into the corners. My granddaughter placed the gift back on the table as if it didn't matter, as if I didn't matter. And here is where the true challenge begins. Not the challenge of making something with your hands, but the challenge of surviving the sting of rejection from the ones you love most. Because survival is not always about food or shelter or breath. It is sometimes about whether your heart can keep beating after it's been trampled by words too heavy for their own weight. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day this story has reached you. Because right now, as I share this with you, I want you to feel the weight of that living room, the weight of standing there as a grandmother whose love was dismissed not with anger, but with indifference. That was the beginning of a night I would never forget. It wasn't just about a gift. It was about being reminded, in the cruelest of ways, that love, when measured by brands and labels, can be tossed aside like wrapping paper. The moment hung in the air, heavier than the balloons floating lazily above our heads. My granddaughter's words didn't just cut through me. They seemed to slice the air itself, leaving behind a stillness that was almost unbearable. My hands twitched slightly, as though they didn't know what to do without the gift they had held so tenderly just seconds before. Her stare was unwavering. Those little eyes, the same ones that once sparkled when she toddled into my arms, were now filled with something I couldn't recognize. Judgment, dismissal, perhaps even shame. Not her shame, but mine. She looked at me as if my effort was not only useless, but embarrassing. I could feel the heat rise in my face, flushing me with the memory of what it meant to feel small, to feel excluded. I forced myself to smile. That's what you do when you are the elder in the family. You swallow the sting. You force the corners of your lips up, even when your heart is shattering in pieces too small to gather. "Oh," I said softly, my voice thinner than I had expected. "Well, maybe it's not exactly what you wanted." She shrugged, already turning away, her tiny fingers reaching for the next wrapped box on the pile. The sound of tearing paper quickly filled the silence again. The family shifted uncomfortably, like no one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. Some cousins laughed too loudly at a different joke. Someone cleared their throat, perhaps hoping to cover the awkwardness. But for me, the room had changed entirely. It was as if I were no longer standing in the same place. I felt like a ghost at my own granddaughter's celebration, invisible and unnecessary. My gift, once glowing with my love, sat abandoned at the edge of the table, a colorful, hand-stitched reminder of my place in their world, outdated, unimportant, unbranded. I looked at my daughter, her mother. For a moment, I thought she would say something, anything, to remind her child that love comes in many forms, but she only bit her lip, eyes darting nervously between me and her daughter. She wanted to comfort me, I could tell, but she also didn't want to dampen her child's joy. And so she said nothing. Silence can wound more than words, and in that moment, her silence pierced me deeper than my granddaughter's remark. The party moved on. The children's laughter grew again, the music played, the cake was cut. But I felt myself shrinking into the background. I clapped when the candles were blown out. I laughed when someone made a silly face. I even helped pass plates around, like everything was fine. Yet my chest burned with the effort of pretending. It wasn't just the rejection of a gift. It was the rejection of me, the person who had made it, the person who had thought it would matter. I could almost hear my own heart whisper, "You don't belong here anymore." But I stayed. I stayed because that is what you do when you love your family, even when they don't always love you in the way you hope. You stay. You endure. You tuck the pain into the quiet corners of your soul and remind yourself that tomorrow is another day. Still, as I sat in that room, watching my granddaughter gush over the expensive toys and designer trinkets others had given her, I couldn't escape the hollow ache inside me. I wondered then, had I failed them? Or had the world changed so much that love without a price tag was no longer enough? The laughter returned, but it wasn't the same. Not for me. It rang hollow, like a bell with a crack running through its center. I sat quietly at the corner of the couch, my hands folded neatly in my lap, forcing myself to blend in with the furniture. Around me, the children tore through boxes, branded dolls, electronics, shiny gadgets that beeped and flashed with artificial joy. Each squeal of delight felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of my handmade gift. The air was heavy with a silence nobody dared to address. It wasn't a loud silence, not like when people argue and then fall quiet. It was softer, slippery, the kind that slides into a room when everyone agrees not to say what's on their mind. Eyes avoided mine. Conversations darted elsewhere. They laughed a little too quickly, clapped a little too eagerly, as if determined to drown out the awkwardness of what had happened. I stared at the table where my gift lay, untouched, its colors suddenly dulled in the glow of store-bought packaging. I imagined the hours I had spent hunched over the fabric, the way my fingers had trembled when threading the needle, the nights I stayed awake thinking, "She'll love this. She has to love this." Now it looked like nothing more than clutter, something to be shoved aside when the party was over. It wasn't only the children's reaction that stung. It was the adults. The very people who once cherished the simplicity of small gestures. They said nothing. They let her words hang in the air without correction, without guidance. My daughter kept glancing at me, her eyes apologetic, but still she remained silent. My son-in-law busied himself with pouring drinks, avoiding my gaze altogether. Not one voice rose to say, "That's not how you speak to your grandmother." Not one hand touched my shoulder in reassurance. I felt like I had been stripped of dignity in front of them all. My identity as the matriarch, the one who had held the family together through hardship, seemed to evaporate in that instant. No one defended me. No one reminded my granddaughter that love cannot be measured in brand names. And so, I sat there, suffocating beneath the weight of their silence. I forced myself to keep smiling, though it trembled at the edges. I even laughed at a joke I didn't hear, clapping along as though I were part of the merriment. But inside, my heart was folding inward, curling into itself like burnt paper. For a brief second, my granddaughter glanced my way again, her new branded doll clutched tightly in her arms. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. She looked triumphant, as though my gift had been a test she had passed, showing the world she knew the difference between what was real and what was cheap. The music swelled. Someone dimmed the lights for the cake, and the children gathered around chanting her name. I sang too, my voice catching on the words, but I sang. Because that's what you do when you're family. You stay, even when it hurts, and you give more love than you receive. But the silence remained, louder in my chest than the song on my lips. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about a gift. It was about a shift in the world I no longer recognized. A world where handmade meant not enough. Where love wasn't measured in effort, but in logos and labels. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, cake, and flashing cameras, I had never felt lonelier in my life. I smiled, but inside, something fragile cracked open like thin glass under too much weight. My granddaughter's words replayed in my head with each passing second, echoing louder than the music, sharper than the clatter of plates. "We only want real brands." The phrase rolled around my mind, biting deeper with every repetition. It wasn't just a rejection of my gift. It was a rejection of me, of what I stood for, of everything I thought mattered in the world of family. I looked down at my hands. They trembled slightly, the same hands that once braided my daughter's hair before school, that once kneaded dough for Sunday dinners, that once carried my granddaughter when she was barely the size of a pillow. These hands had written love into fabric and wood and thread, and yet tonight they seemed empty, useless, as if love itself no longer had a place here. The gift sat on the corner of the table, abandoned, its ribbon now hanging loose, its colors dim in the shadow of the bright boxes piled high around it. No one reached for it. No one spoke of it. The sight of it was like looking at a wound I could not cover, no matter how tightly I held my smile in place. Shame rose up in me, a hot wave that made my cheeks flush. I wondered if the others could see it, if they were laughing louder to cover not only her words, but also my humiliation. It hurt more than anger, because anger burns bright and quick, but shame lingers, clings to your bones like dampness in the winter air. I thought back to all the nights I spent working on that gift. How I sat by the lamp, the only light in the house, carefully stitching and smoothing, whispering little prayers into the fabric. Let this make her smile. Let her feel my love. Every tug of the needle had been a thread tying me closer to her. And now, in one sentence, she had cut it loose. But I didn't let the tears fall. Not here. Not in front of them. I held them back with every ounce of strength I had, swallowing the lump in my throat until it ached, because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I clapped when others clapped. I laughed when someone told a story, though the words barely reached my ears. I stood to help pass slices of cake, my smile stretched thin, a mask that no one seemed to notice. Perhaps they were too relieved that the awkward moment had passed. Perhaps they thought I was fine. But inside, I was screaming. And yet, as I placed a plate of cake in front of my granddaughter, I looked at her face. She was glowing, happy, utterly oblivious to the storm she had caused in my heart. For her, the night was perfect. She had the brands she wanted, the friends who admired her gifts, the parents who let her say what she pleased. She had everything, except the understanding that words can wound deeper than any blade. As I looked at her, the pain twisted into something else. A question. Where did I go wrong? Was it me who failed to teach my daughter the value of love beyond brands? Or had the world itself shifted so far that handmade no longer meant special, but worthless? The cake melted sweet on my tongue, but it tasted bitter in my heart. I forced myself to swallow, to keep breathing, to keep surviving through the quiet humiliation that burned like a hidden flame. And in that moment, I realized something painful. Love alone was not enough anymore. Not for them. And perhaps, not even for me. The laughter swirled around me, but my mind was far away, drifting backward into memories that felt warmer, safer, like a quilt I could wrap myself in against the chill of the present moment. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the sound of children's voices blur into the background, and suddenly, I was no longer sitting in that room. I was standing in a small kitchen, 30 years younger, with my daughter tugging at my apron. "Is it ready yet, Mama?" she would ask, eyes sparkling with that innocent joy only children can carry. I would laugh, pull her into my arms, and hand her the little cloth doll I had just finished stitching. She would hug it so tightly, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Back then, handmade meant everything. It meant love, sacrifice, and survival. We didn't always have enough money for store-bought toys, but that never mattered. My daughter believed those handmade gifts were magical because she knew her mother's hands had made them. Every uneven stitch was proof that I cared enough to try, even when I was tired from long days of work. I remembered the evenings when I stayed up late, repairing her school clothes so she wouldn't be teased. The nights when I sewed costumes for school plays because the shop-bought ones were too expensive. She never looked embarrassed then. In fact, she would beam with pride, standing taller than the rest, because she knew her mother's hands had created something just for her. Those were days when family meant simplicity, when effort was valued more than price tags, when love was measured not in money, but in time. And now, sitting in that brightly lit living room, watching my granddaughter toss aside what I had made, I wondered when it all changed. When did my stitches lose their worth? When did the weight of love become lighter than the weight of a brand label? I thought of the little traditions I had tried to pass down, the way we baked together during holidays, the way we crafted decorations out of scraps, the way we found joy in creating rather than buying. My daughter had once loved those traditions. She had once told me she wanted to teach them to her own children. And yet, here we were, and her child looked at my gift with disdain. Maybe it wasn't her fault. Maybe it wasn't even my daughter's fault. The world had changed, pushing its way into our family, teaching them that only what came with a recognizable name had value. Commercials flashing on every screen, classmates flaunting what their parents bought. It had shaped her, just as my simpler world had shaped me. Still, the ache remained. A part of me longed to go back, to hold my little girl again, to hear her squeal with joy over something simple I had made with my tired hands. Back when love was enough. Back when she believed in me. The memory was so vivid, it almost felt like I could touch it. But when I opened my eyes, reality came rushing back, sharp and unkind. The kitchen was gone. My daughter was no longer a child. My granddaughter's laughter rang out as she showed her friends the latest shiny gift from the pile, while my own sat untouched, forgotten. A deep breath trembled in my chest. I smiled again, but it wasn't joy, it was survival. Because in that moment, all I had left were the memories of better days and the painful reminder that they might never come again. The laughter of the children carried on, but my heart was already far away, caught between the warmth of my memories and the chill of the present moment. I could not help but see, with painful clarity, how much the world had shifted between my generation and theirs. It was like standing at the edge of a river, watching the water rush past, knowing that no matter how much you reach out, you can never catch it in your hands. In my time, value was tied to effort. A dress patched carefully was worn with pride. A table repaired by hand became sturdier because it held not just nails and wood, but the intention of the person who fixed it. We admired resourcefulness, not labels. We respected those who could make do with little, who carried dignity in the face of scarcity. But now, I was staring at a new world. A world where children learned to measure worth by the weight of logos stamped onto plastic and fabric. A world where parents, even my own daughter, felt pressure to give in, to keep up appearances, to ensure their children were never left out. Perhaps they believed they were protecting them. Perhaps they were afraid that teaching them to love simplicity would mean leaving them vulnerable to ridicule. I sat in that party and realized that this change wasn't just about gifts. It was about identity. My granddaughter's words weren't born in isolation. They were a reflection of everything she saw around her. Television screens flashing advertisements, classmates comparing what they wore, social media parading endless images of perfection. She had learned the language of brands before she had learned the language of gratitude. And I, sitting quietly on that couch, felt the divide. It wasn't just about years separating us. It was about values, about how each generation sees the world and what it chooses to hold dear. For me, love was enough. For her, it seemed love was invisible without the right label stitched onto it. I thought of my daughter again, the little girl who once cherished every handmade dress and toy. She had grown up in my world, but she had crossed the bridge into theirs. Now she stood between us, caught in the middle, her silence betraying the pull of both sides. She remembered what it felt like to hold something made with love, yet she understood her daughter's hunger for belonging in a world that punished difference. Her quiet eyes told me she was torn, and in that, I saw both pity and helplessness. The shift of generations was not only inevitable, it was merciless. The ways of one era often dissolve in the next, like ink fading in the sun. I wanted to shout that handmade still mattered, that effort and love carried more weight than a store-bought trinket. But I knew my words would fall flat against the tide. The children would laugh, the adults would nod politely, then turn back to their conversations, and I would still be sitting alone, a relic of another time. Yet, in that awareness, there was also something sobering. The truth was that my granddaughter was not cruel by nature. She was simply reflecting the world she had been given. She was a child who had been taught, by society and perhaps by her own parents' choices, that what is valuable must come from a shelf, not from someone's hands. The fault was not hers alone. It was the world's. It was ours. I sipped the drink my son-in-law had quietly placed on the table beside me, and for a moment, I let the cold liquid anchor me in the present. The chatter rose again, the birthday candles flickered, and the children continued to unwrap their treasures. And I sat there, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me. The weight of knowing that my way of loving had become foreign in my own family. The shift of generations had taken more than traditions. It had taken away the language of love I once spoke so fluently, replacing it with symbols I could not understand. And in that moment, I realized the river was still flowing, swift and relentless, carrying them further away from the shore where I still stood, clutching the remnants of another time. The chatter of the party spilled from one corner to the next, but I couldn't keep my ears from catching the whispers that seemed to ripple just beneath it. Words carried differently when spoken in hushed tones, when lips bent close to ears. They were meant to be hidden, but they found me anyway. "She still makes those things?" one relative muttered, the disbelief thinly veiled. "It's sweet, I guess, but kids don't care about that anymore," another voice replied, as though the idea of my effort was quaint, like something outdated on display in a museum. A soft laugh followed. "She doesn't understand. Handmade is nice, but it's not enough." Each whisper felt like a needle poking into my chest, not sharp enough to kill, but relentless enough to bruise. I pretended not to hear, my eyes fixed on the half-eaten slice of cake in front of me, but inside, I heard every syllable as though it had been shouted across the room. Outdated, not enough, doesn't understand. It was strange how quickly the words stripped me of belonging. I wasn't just the grandmother who made a gift. I was now the outsider who still believed in something everyone else had moved on from. A relic, sitting in the middle of a celebration that should have been filled with joy. I wanted to defend myself, to rise and say, "I understand more than you think. I understand what it means to work with nothing and still make something. I understand what it means to give love even when love isn't returned." But the words caught in my throat. Defensiveness would only prove their whispers right. And so I stayed silent, swallowing my pride as though it were a bitter pill I couldn't spit out. I glanced at my granddaughter, glowing in the center of attention, clutching her brand new doll, laughter spilling from her lips. She didn't hear the whispers, or if she did, she didn't care. But I did. Every word etched itself into me, confirming what I had feared since I walked through that door. I no longer belonged in the space I once helped build. The irony wasn't lost on me. This family, these children, the very home we stood in, it all existed because I once worked with my hands. I cooked, I sewed, I saved, I built. My sacrifices had created the foundation that allowed them to live more comfortably now. And yet, those same hands, those same values, were now dismissed as irrelevant. I folded my hands in my lap, hiding the tremble of my fingers. The whispers continued, but I forced myself to focus on the hum of the refrigerator, the scrape of forks against plates, the thud of feet running across the floorboards. Anything but their voices. But still, the words clung to me. They didn't fade when the music grew louder. They didn't disappear when the cake was cleared away. They echoed inside me, reshaping the way I saw myself in their eyes. Not a grandmother, not a matriarch, not even a guest of honor. Just an old woman with outdated ways, sitting in silence while the world moved on without her. And in that realization, the party no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like exile. Later that evening, after the cake had been eaten and the presents had been stacked neatly in the corner, my daughter slipped into the kitchen where I was quietly rinsing my plate. The clatter of voices from the living room softened behind her, as though she had pulled a door between us and the world. For a moment, it was just the two of us, mother and daughter, the way it used to be. She touched my arm gently, her hand trembling as though even this small gesture carried weight. "Mom," she whispered, her voice low. "I'm sorry." I turned to her, searching her eyes. They were the same eyes I remembered from her childhood, brown, wide, full of emotions she tried to hide. And now they looked torn, caught between loyalty to me and loyalty to her daughter. "You don't need to be sorry," I told her, forcing a smile. My voice cracked slightly, and I hoped she didn't hear it. "It's just a gift. Children don't always understand." But she shook her head, her lips pressed tightly as if holding back words that threatened to spill out. "No, Mom. I should have said something. When she said that to you, I should have stopped her. I should have told her she was wrong." Her shoulders slumped, and I saw the exhaustion there, not just from the party, but from years of balancing between two worlds. She knew what it meant to grow up with handmade things, to treasure them. But she also knew the weight of raising children in a society that demanded appearances, that punished those who didn't keep up. She was caught between the old lessons I had given her and the new expectations pressing down on her children. I reached up and touched her cheek, my thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her effort to hold it back. "You're doing your best," I said softly. "I know it's hard. Times have changed." Her lips trembled. "But it hurt you." I saw it. "I didn't know what to do, Mom. If I corrected her in front of everyone, she would have been embarrassed, and the night would have turned sour. But by saying nothing," her voice cracked, "I hurt you instead." For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was louder than our words, the kind of silence that carried the weight of truth. I could see in her eyes that she carried guilt, and in mine, I carried sadness. But beneath it all, there was love. A love complicated by years, by change, by mistakes, but love all the same. I smiled again, though it was weary, fragile. "I'll survive," I whispered. "I always have." She leaned into me then, resting her forehead against my shoulder. I held her, feeling her heartbeat against mine, and for the first time that night, I allowed my own tears to slip silently down my cheeks. Not from anger, not even from shame, but from the ache of knowing that love sometimes means swallowing your pain so the people you love don't drown in theirs. Her arms tightened around me, as though she were the child again, and I was the one who could still protect her from the world. And though her apology couldn't erase what had happened, it stitched something small back together inside me. Not a full repair, just a thread, a beginning. But as we stood there, I also knew this moment would pass quickly. She would return to the party, to her children, to her role as mother first and daughter second. And I would return to my corner, where the laughter would once again feel like it came from another room. Still, for that fleeting moment in the kitchen, I wasn't alone. When the last of the candles burned down and the wrapping paper had been swept into bags, I slipped quietly out of the house. No one stopped me, not because they didn't care, but because they were too busy saying their goodbyes to each other, too distracted with their arms full of branded toys and laughter that no longer seemed to need me. I stepped outside into the cool night, and the air hit me like a wave, sharp and clean, almost cleansing. The street was still. The faint hum of traffic in the distance was the only sound, a low reminder that life outside that house carried on, unaware of the little heartbreaks happening within its walls. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and began the walk home. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not because of my age, but because of what I carried with me, an invisible weight pressing down. the weight of words that had been spoken and words that had not. The sidewalks were cracked in places, just as I felt inside. I remembered walking these same streets years ago, holding my daughter's hand as she skipped alongside me, humming songs we both knew by heart. Back then, the weight I carried was groceries or fabric for sewing, never shame. Back then, the world still felt warm. Tonight, the streetlights cast long shadows that stretched in front of me, reminding me of time itself, always moving ahead, always pulling us forward whether we are ready or not. My shoes scraped softly against the pavement, and I could almost hear the echo of my thoughts bouncing back at me. You don't belong anymore. You don't belong. The phrase haunted me with every step. My granddaughter hadn't meant it in those exact words, but her rejection had spoken it louder than any direct insult could. And the silence of the others, the way they let it pass without correction, that was the echo that would not fade. I passed by the little park where I once sat with my daughter, where I once pushed her on the swing, the chains creaking as she flew higher and higher, shouting that she wanted to touch the sky. I had laughed then, proud of her spirit, proud that she believed the sky could be hers if she only reached far enough. Now, I wondered if I had failed her somehow, if I had not taught her how to carry that joy without the burden of needing to prove herself through things money could buy. The walk was not long, but it felt endless. Each block stretched like an entire mile. The night air seemed to press against me, whispering all the thoughts I tried to bury during the party. I slowed my steps, letting the ache of it wash over me, because rushing home wouldn't change anything. The truth would follow me there, waiting for me in the quiet, just as surely as it followed me on this lonely street. By the time I reached my front door, my legs ached, and my heart felt heavier than when I had first stepped outside. I placed my hand on the doorknob, pausing for a moment, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the glass. My eyes looked tired, older somehow. My shoulders drooped under the invisible weight of rejection. And then I stepped inside, into the silence of my little home. No laughter, no music, just me, and the echoes of a night that had reminded me painfully of how far I had drifted from the people I loved. Inside my little home, the silence was thick. So thick, it felt like it pressed against my skin. I set down my shawl and sat at the edge of the bed, my body still carrying the stiffness of the evening. My eyes landed on the small workshop tucked into the corner of the room, where scraps of fabric and jars of buttons rested in quiet chaos. The scissors gleamed faintly under the lamp, the needle I had left threaded still waiting for me, as though it had never noticed I had gone. This room had always been my sanctuary. The hum of the sewing machine, the soft snip of scissors, the patient tug of thread, it was here I felt most myself. Here, I was not just a grandmother, or an aging woman trying to keep up with a world moving too fast. Here, I was a creator, a storyteller with fabric as my language. Every stitch I made told a story of survival, of sacrifice, of love. But tonight, even this space felt different. I looked at the unfinished projects spread across the table, a scarf I was knitting for winter, a set of cloth dolls waiting for faces, a blanket I had been patching with careful precision. Normally, they would fill me with warmth and purpose. Tonight, they only reminded me of how little those things seemed to matter to anyone else. I ran my fingers across the soft fabric, remembering all the times my hands had moved through these motions with hope. Each creation had been born out of love, not necessity alone. And yet, they now sat like relics of a past the world no longer wanted. A sharp ache rose in my chest, but I swallowed it back. I wasn't going to let the sting of one night, one cruel phrase, erase what these things meant to me. Still, the doubt lingered. Am I holding on to something no one values anymore? Am I nothing more than a shadow clinging to outdated ways? The needle gleamed at me, almost taunting. I picked it up, its weight both familiar and comforting. I threaded it slowly, the way I always had, letting muscle memory guide me. And as the thread slipped through the eye, I breathed a little easier. Here, at least, I was still capable. Here, my hands still had purpose. I began to stitch. Not because anyone would ask for what I made, not because anyone would thank me, but because the act itself grounded me. The fabric stretched beneath my hands, pliable and forgiving, unlike the sharpness of words. I stitched slowly, deliberately, pouring my sorrow into every movement. And as I worked, I realized something. This craft was not only about giving, it was about remembering who I was, about holding on to the pieces of myself that no rejection could erase. Yes, the world had shifted. Yes, the children wanted brands, and the adults whispered of outdated ways. But here, in this quiet room, I still had my voice, my gift, my worth. I leaned back in the chair and let the unfinished blanket drape over my lap. The colors glowed softly in the lamplight, muted but warm, like a quiet fire. For a moment, I closed my eyes and let myself imagine a world where handmade was still treasured, where my granddaughter would clutch this blanket to her chest with pride instead of tossing it aside. The fantasy was bittersweet, but it kept me company. And in that moment, I knew that even if no one else saw the value, I could not abandon it. My workshop, my tools, my stitches, they were pieces of my soul. They would outlast the silence, the whispers, and even the sting of my granddaughter's words. I stitched until the clock struck midnight, until my eyelids grew heavy and the ache in my fingers returned. And when I finally set the needle down, I felt lighter, not healed, not whole, but lighter. Because here, in the shadows of my small workshop, I still mattered. The next evening, as I sat again at my little table with scraps of fabric spread out before me, a soft knock came at the door. It startled me. Visitors were rare at this hour. I hesitated before opening it, expecting perhaps a neighbor returning a dish or someone selling something I didn't need. But when I pulled the door open, I found a child standing there. My neighbor's little girl, no more than 9 or 10. She held something in her hands. A ragged stuffed toy, its seams split, stuffing peeking out like clouds trying to escape the sky. Her eyes were wide, nervous but hopeful. Mrs. Tran? She whispered. My mama said you know how to fix things. Could you fix this for me? For a moment, I just stared at her, the weight of last night still heavy on my chest. Then I looked at the toy. Well loved, carried and hugged until it could no longer hold itself together. And something inside me stirred. Here, in this little girl's hands, was proof that not everyone measured love in brands and labels. Some still found value in what was cherished, no matter how worn it became. I smiled gently and nodded. Of course, sweetheart. Come in. She stepped inside shyly, her eyes darting around my small living room, lingering on the piles of fabric, the jars of buttons, the half-finished blanket draped across the chair. To her, it must have looked like a treasure chest of possibilities. As I sat down with the toy in my lap, she watched closely, her small hands clutching the edge of the table. I threaded the needle slowly, letting her see each step, and began stitching the seam back together. The toy seemed to sigh with relief under my hands, as though it had been waiting for this reunion with care. You're really good at this, she whispered in awe. I chuckled softly. I've had many years of practice. Her eyes lit up. Could you maybe teach me someday? I want to learn how to make things too. The words stopped me for a heartbeat. No one had asked me that in so long. My own granddaughter had rejected my gift, but here was another child, one not even related to me, asking to learn the very craft that had been dismissed as useless. A warmth spread in my chest, soft and steady. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in days. "Yes, I can teach you." She grinned, her face glowing brighter than the lamplight, and in that small smile, something in me healed just a little. Because maybe the world hadn't completely forgotten. Maybe there were still hearts open to the kind of love that can't be bought, only made. When I handed the toy back to her, newly whole, she hugged it fiercely to her chest. "Thank you," she beamed, and in that gratitude, I felt more valued than I had in a long time. After she left, I sat back at my table, my fingers resting on the fabric scraps once more. For the first time since the party, I didn't feel invisible. I felt needed. I felt seen, and it was enough to remind me. My worth wasn't measured in my granddaughter's eyes alone. It could be found in the quiet corners, in the small moments, in the unexpected visitor who knocked on my door and asked me to share what I carried. That little girl's visit stayed with me long after she skipped away with her mended toy. Her knock on my door had been small, but to me, it felt like the universe itself had tapped on my shoulder, reminding me I wasn't entirely forgotten. For days afterward, I found myself smiling more often in my workshop, humming softly as I stitched. Each cut of the fabric, each loop of thread, no longer felt like a futile act. Instead, they felt like quiet declarations. I am still here. What I create still matters. As I worked, a new thought began to take root. Maybe the value of what I made didn't depend on whether my family recognized it. Maybe it wasn't about whether my granddaughter wanted brands or whether relatives whispered about my old ways. Maybe it was about me, about the fact that these hands, though weathered and tired, could still bring beauty into the world. I picked up the unfinished blanket draped across my chair and ran my fingers over the stitches. Each square was made from scraps of fabric that told a story. An old shirt my daughter once wore, a piece of curtain that had hung in our living room for years, bits of fabric gifted to me by neighbors. Woven together, they weren't just a blanket. They were memory, history, resilience. And as I looked at it, I realized something powerful. The worth of my gift had never been about whether it carried a logo. It carried me. It carried my time, my love, my history. And that would always matter, even if the world couldn't see it. I leaned back in my chair and let myself breathe, deeply and fully, for the first time since the party. The sting was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I thought about my granddaughter again, her words sharp and dismissive, and for once, they didn't pierce as deeply. She was still young. Perhaps one day she would understand. But even if she never did, I would not let her ignorance erase me. The door knocked again one afternoon, and it was the same little neighbor girl, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She had brought a scrap of cloth and a handful of mismatched buttons. "Can you show me?" she asked breathlessly. "I want to make something like you." And so, we sat together at my table. I guided her small hands, showing her how to push the needle through fabric, how to tie a knot so the thread wouldn't slip loose. She pricked her finger once and giggled, sticking it in her mouth before trying again. Her determination made me laugh. Real laughter this time, not the hollow kind I had forced at the party. Hours passed without notice. When she finally held up the uneven little doll she had stitched, her grin was wide enough to light the whole room. "I made this," she declared proudly, "all by myself." I looked at her, and something inside me shifted. I realized this was what it meant to matter. Not applause from a crowded room, not validation from those chasing brands, but the quiet joy of passing on a skill, of seeing someone else find pride in their own two hands. That night, as I put away the scraps, I whispered to myself, "My worth is not theirs to decide. It is mine to carry." And for the first time, I believed it. Another family gathering came not long after, this time a quieter dinner rather than a noisy party. I almost didn't go. The memory of my granddaughter's words still clung to me like a bruise that hadn't fully healed. But something inside urged me forward, not to prove myself, but to stand in my truth, to show them that my silence wasn't weakness and my handmade gifts weren't shame. I arrived with nothing in my hands this time. No wrapped boxes, no stitched treasures, no ribbons carefully tied. Instead, I brought myself, steady and calm. The table was already filled with dishes, the chatter buzzing in the air. My granddaughter sat at the far end, chattering about school and showing off a new bracelet her friend had given her. I took my seat quietly, listening, observing. For a while, the evening carried on without tension, as though the last incident had never happened. But when dessert was served, I cleared my throat gently, and the room softened into silence. All eyes turned to me. "I want to say something," I began, my voice even but firm. "The other night, I brought a gift that was made by my own hands. It wasn't wrapped in a brand name, but it carried something else. My love, my time, my effort. And when it was rejected, it hurt." The words hung there. My granddaughter froze, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. My daughter's face flushed pink, her eyes darting between me and her child. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I continued, steady now. "I know times are different. I know children are taught to love things they see on screens, things with logos and prices attached. But I need you all to understand something. Handmade doesn't mean worthless. It means someone loved you enough to spend hours thinking of you, creating something only you could have." My granddaughter's eyes dropped to her plate. For the first time, she looked small, unsure. "I didn't mean—" She started softly, but I lifted a hand. "I know," I said gently. "You're young. The world tells you what's valuable, and sometimes it drowns out the voices of those who came before you. But I hope one day you'll understand that not everything important comes from a store." The room was still. My daughter's eyes glistened, tears she tried to hide. My son-in-law cleared his throat, murmuring something about respect, and my granddaughter, cheeks flushed now, whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "I'm sorry, Grandma." The words weren't perfect. They didn't erase the sting of that night. But they were a beginning, a fragile bridge stretched between us. I smiled, not triumphant, but tender. "That's all I needed," I whispered. The dinner carried on, lighter somehow. Not everyone agreed. I could see it in the way some relatives avoided my gaze, but it didn't matter. I had spoken my truth. I had placed my heart on the table, not as a gift to be dismissed, but as a reminder that I still had a place here. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me. Not the ache of shame, but the quiet strength of dignity reclaimed. In the days that followed that dinner, something subtle shifted. Not everything, not all at once, but enough for me to notice. My granddaughter no longer looked at me with that dismissive glare. Instead, she seemed quieter in my presence, almost cautious, as if she wasn't sure how to undo what had already been done. At first, she kept her distance. But slowly, in small ways, she began to inch closer. One afternoon, while I was helping clear the table after another meal, She came to my side. Her voice was low, almost timid. "Grandma, do you still have that blanket you were making?" I paused, surprised by the question. I nodded. "Yes, it's not finished yet." She shifted from foot to foot, her eyes downcast. "Can I see it sometime?" The words were quiet, but they glowed inside me like embers. She wasn't ready to say much more, and I didn't press her. But in that small request, I felt a glimmer of understanding, a thread of connection beginning to stitch itself back between us. Not everyone softened, though. Some relatives still whispered about how out of touch I was. At the next family gathering, I overheard an aunt sighing. "It's sweet, but kids don't need those old things. They'll just sit in a drawer." Their voices didn't sting the way they once had, though. I had already spoken my truth. I no longer needed their approval to validate me. What mattered was the flicker of curiosity I saw in my granddaughter's eyes. The way she seemed to be rethinking, even if she didn't yet know how to express it. Children grow, after all. They learn, they unlearn, and sometimes it takes a harsh moment to plant a seed that blooms years later. My daughter, too, changed in small ways. She began to mention more often the toys and clothes I had once made for her, telling little stories at the table that brought laughter and softened the air. It felt like her way of reminding her children, reminding herself that handmade had always been part of our family's story. I knew better than to expect miracles. The world outside still pulled them toward brands and appearances, still convinced them that worth came with a price tag. But within our home, within those dinners and conversations, there was a small shift, a recognition, not from everyone, but from enough. And for me, that was enough, because love doesn't always come in applause or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in quiet apologies, in a child asking softly if she can see the blanket her grandmother is still making. I realized then that my role was not to compete with the world, not to convince every voice at the table. My role was to hold steady, to keep creating, to keep offering love in the way I knew best. Some might reject it, but others, sooner or later, would see it for what it was. And so, I stitched on. Not just fabric, but the fragile threads of family, weaving them patiently, knowing that even if the pattern took years to show, the work itself was worth it. The seasons turned, and with them, so did the rhythm of our family. There were still parties, still dinners, still moments when I felt out of place among their chatter about new gadgets and trending brands. But there were also softer moments. Times when my granddaughter would sit beside me, not saying much, but watching as my hands moved steadily with needle and thread. Her silence no longer felt cold. It felt curious, even tender. One evening, she touched the fabric of the blanket I had been working on. Her fingers traced the seams clumsily, as though trying to understand the language of stitches. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. We didn't need to. In that quiet exchange, I felt the faintest spark of recognition, the kind that cannot be forced but only waited for. The relatives who once whispered still did, their voices floating at the edges of family gatherings, but their words no longer had sharp edges for me. I had learned to let them blur, to fade like distant echoes. What mattered was the warmth of my little home, the laughter of the neighbor's child, who still came by with scraps of fabric, eager to learn. What mattered was my daughter's occasional stories at the table, weaving memories of her childhood into the present, stitching me back into the family narrative, thread by thread. And what mattered most was the peace I began to feel inside. Not the loud peace of being celebrated, but the quiet one of knowing my worth didn't depend on applause, or brands, or even full acceptance. It lived here, in my hands, in the creations born from them, in the love I had always given. The nights grew longer, and I found myself slowing down in everything I did. I stitched more gently, walked more slowly, spoke more softly. The world still rushed on, chasing its brands and labels, but I allowed myself to linger, to take time with each moment. Because I knew now, it was not about being understood by everyone. It was about being true to myself and leaving behind traces of that truth for those willing to see. When I whispered goodbye to you tonight, dear listener, I hope you carry this with you. Love is not measured in logos. It is measured in time, in care, in hands that tremble, but keep creating anyway. If you have ever felt invisible, dismissed, or unworthy, remember, your worth is not theirs to decide. It is yours to live, quietly and boldly, even in a world that forgets. The room around me grows dim now, shadows stretching gently across the walls. I close my eyes and let the images blur. The party, the whispers, the laughter, the stitches. They blur like a painting washed with water, leaving behind only softness. And so, with a quiet heart, I whisper farewell. Not in anger, not in pain, but in peace.